Hi, I want to talk about the history of the present. Now, the history of the present, and when we look at it from a Goan point of view, reminds us about the work of Pankaj Mishra, who wrote The Age of Anger, the history of present. That's what actually inspired me to think about why we are here at this moment when we are, as Goans, united, filled with harmony, and we feel somebody's out there to break this centuries old harmony that we have built together as ones. The history of present, we have reached here not because uh, there is no connection with the past. That's why we need to move into the past. And to move into the past, I thought perhaps not just to go with Pankaj Mishra, who seemed to suggest that the history of the present is built by the losers of history. The victors of history have moved on and they forgot to factor in the losers of history who now have taken charge of our present. While I'm distinguishing this position and distancing myself from that position of Pankaj Mishra, I would like to take up Michel Foucault, who talks about looking at the past through the window of practices. We are usually looking at the past through the windows of events, wars, victories, villains, victims, and triumphs. I thought perhaps it will be interesting to look at practices and see how, from the Foucaultian point of view, when I look at the genealogy, the past of us Goans, the present Goan is a child of the past, certainly. The genealogical tree can be traced through. So, what kind of Goan can emerge down the past? If at all, we can talk about even of a Goan before the Portuguese could arrive. So, this is a genealogical approach where the genealogical tree is being traced down the history. I would rather like to look at not the genealogical tree because I will not be able to trace a Goan in a pre-Portuguese Goa because there was no idea of Goa in the way we have it today. And there were not everyone were united as Goans the way we are together today. And so that is the reason that becomes a little difficult to look through the past. So I thought perhaps the archaeological method, going deeper into the layers of this past of Goa, to trace how we are where we are, so that we can have the history of the present. Now, the history of the present, uh, open through practices. The present practices that we can see are trying to look through us and them. The practices are about who is loyal and who's a traitor, who is a victim and who is a victor. And this type of binaries are used by portraying the villains of the past to create divisions in the present. And so that is where we are right now, perhaps. And that is also not very well received. And so there are poems who reject all this type of binaries and they stand together and fight this type of imposition of divisions from outside. And so that is where we are right now. From where did we arrive here? And to arrive where we are and to get to that position, perhaps practices will help us. And so archaeology, looking at past through the window of practices, helps us to understand history is not just isolated isms or doctrines or paradigms or ways of looking at life, but there are practices that can be then seen as operative through a particular paradigm, a particular way of looking at the world. And so when we look at these practices, perhaps we can identify three important epistemes from where all these practices can be seen. At different times, perhaps these practices have different meaning and different ways of being in the world. And so pre-Portuguese Goa had practices, certainly, but they were very different from what we are today. The practices of that time were mainly to build a community, to live along ecology, the temple, the village, the Gaukarias, the weather, everything was intertwined, and life was following the clock of climate. When it is rain, perhaps there was cultivation, and every person in the village was involved in agriculture. And so there are different climatic changes during the seasons. Things changed according to the seasons, and everything was centered around a temple and around the village and the Gamkarya system. So now there is no wisdom or doctrine that animates practices. Practices were simply alongside to build a community. And so this was a dharmic period, the dharmic traditions of which now we call Hinduism, uh, also the shamanic traditions that were present, and even today they are still with us. The kind of everything was together, nothing in conflict. It doesn't mean there were no doctrines, there were no isms. It was there, they were in their own place, but they had no way of legitimizing practices. Practices were religious, practices were political, practices were also human and celebrated. So therefore, within the village, there were ways of doing things. Of course, there were shamanic practices where people would think that they can communicate with the spirits. There were gadis who could claim that we can go into the past and talk to a dead soul. There were gadis who can put you into a trance and you can communicate with your ancestors. Also, there was a kind of systems by which we could, gadis and their trance could heal people. And so there were different types of shamanism where this kind of magic working around, which we might today call superstition. But at the same time, Goa was not one against the other. The Shamanism was very much part of the dharmic traditions, and everything lived together without any conflict. There was no oppositional way of looking at life. There was no us and them. So there was one collective way of being. There were private republics. All these Namkaryas were private republics. They would look into their own affairs, while the king who ruled over Goa would receive only a tax, and he would not interfere into the internal affairs of this village life. And that is why this was one type of a world which got disrupted under colonization. And that's where we have many consequences of this event, and that is it has what it has done to us perhaps is very important when practices were now turning into one those that have to be validated by a doctor. And so practice needed to be approved, practice needed to be one that are pure, and those that are pure will become validated by a book. And sometimes the book of the Christians called the Bible, the text becomes very important. The land has to have a paper, a text written. And so from where we reach where? So now with the coming of the colonizer, we enter a new episteme. Practices still exist, but the practices are lesser when it comes to the text. And the text which comes from the Bible, which comes from written records, which comes from birth certificates, which comes from death certificates, marriage certificates, all that validates practices. Coming together as husband and wife is validated by a written text. So therefore, this change happens as we move into the second stage with the coming of the body. Steadily, we become text-oriented. And so the dharmic traditions, which usually were having text, but text has its own place without hierarchy, all were practices that were building a community, suddenly Now, all practices had to be validated as pure or impure, approved as pure, impure by authority, and this authority derived ultimately from a text. And so we became a text tradition from the practice tradition. And so that moved from there to this point, and all doctrine became so important. And that is because of the coming of the West, the coming of the book, the coming of traditions of the book and the written word. And so this is where we are now facing ourselves in the third episteme, post-colonially. It is now thought that somebody is impure, somebody is pure. The practice is based on a particular idea of purity, abstracted directly from lived life. And so the lived life that we find today in our society is being proved, whether it's valid, invalid, whether it is right, pure, whether it's loyal, disloyal, whether it's victim or villain or victor. All this comes from the positions of a doctrine. So the locus of our thought is a doctrine. Locus of our thought was practiced once upon a time. And that's why dharma, the dharmic traditions, lost through coming to the book, to a cognitive understanding, which then understands others vis-a-vis oneself. So that comes the us and them politics that we find today, and we are now converted, to use the word in inverted commas, to the text. And that is where, unfortunately, in the name of going back to decolonial, pre-colonial life, which cannot be retraced, unfortunately, there is a conflict in Goa. There's a kind of trying to restore what was lost in the past through claiming victimhood and creating new villains in the present. And so that is where I just like to bring to our attention that the present, what we have, has arrived on the back of colonization. And so truly, it is important to decolonize, but this decolonization of being a victim of the past is actually a fruit of colonization of our mind. And that's where we need to come to an awareness that distancing ourselves from the past does not necessarily make us not does not necessarily make us free from the colonial burden. The colonial burden and the coloniality of colonization, the power equation of coloniality is domination of the colonizer. The colonization is over, but we are reproducing various colonialities in our days, and we want to dominate and reproduce the colonizer and colonial relations. But this time, the colonizer is from inside, the victor is from inside, and the victim is also from inside. So we are producing colonialities which are free from the colonizer, but carrying forward his rules of the game that he played in Goa, in other places too. So the regime of truth, the regime of praxis that we find today, the practices that we find today are actually producing coloniality. And therefore, colonization is not over. We are carrying the yoke of colonization today. So it's important that all of us understand, look at the history of our present and try to free us so that the dharmic way of living, the Shramanic way of living, the Christian way of living can live together, the praxis, the practices, and also the doctrines. They can survive, embrace each other, survive together, and create a happy, prosperous, and peaceful human society. Thank you.